Micah used to believe a full plate meant a full life. Every afternoon when the school bus coughed to a stop in front of the peeling duplex he called home, he would sprint inside and find a fresh turkey sandwich waiting on the table. Perfect slices neatly stacked, the kind of sandwich that looked like something out of a diner ad. It didn't matter if the house smelled like mold after a rainstorm or if the electricity flickered when the kettle was plugged in. As long as there was that sandwich, Micah thought everything was fine. After all, his mother smiled every time she handed it to him. But the truth was, everything wasn't fine. The day his father slammed the door for the last time, Micah didn't cry. He stood still as a tombstone while his mother whispered promises he didn't understand. She told him it wasn't his fault. She told him they would be okay. What she didn't say was how she would piece together the wreckage left behind. His father left to chase a new family, one that promised him a brighter future and maybe a better son. Micah stayed behind with a woman who worked double shifts at a greasy diner, who skipped lunch so he could eat dinner, who stitched their survival together out of coupons and prayers. On the outside, their life looked manageable. There was still a roof. There were still Christmas lights in the window, even if half the bulbs were burnt out, and there were always those sandwiches waiting faithfully. It wasn't until years later, long after childhood innocence had peeled away, that Micah would realize what those sandwiches really meant. At school, the other kids could smell the difference on him. They wore fresh sneakers and laughed about family vacations to the coast. Micah patched the holes in his jeans with safety pins. He learned early to walk quickly with his head down, to leave no space for questions he didn't want to answer. The weight of being different grew heavier with every year, not just because of the missing father, but because of the quiet truths Micah was beginning to understand about himself. He moved differently. His voice tilted at the edge. He didn't talk about crushes because the names in his heart didn't match the ones the other boys joked about. In a town like theirs, different wasn't brave, it was dangerous. Still, Micah believed in the magic of small things. He believed in the way his mother winked at him across the dinner table, as if sharing a secret language only they spoke. He believed in the way she called him my best boy when she thought he was asleep. He believed that sandwiches stacked with care could keep the loneliness at bay. He believed that love, even the battered, weary kind, was enough to patch over all the empty spaces his father had left. There was one afternoon Micah never forgot. A thunderstorm had rolled in, the sky swollen and mean, and the school sent them home early. His mother was still at work, the house too quiet. Micah, hungry and restless, wandered into the kitchen and grabbed the plate waiting on the counter. He wasn't thinking. He bit into the sandwich without hesitation, and then he tasted it. The bread was dry and stale. The turkey was thin, cracked at the edges like it had sat in the fridge too long. Under the top slice, he found the truth. Scraps pieced together, hidden carefully to look whole. It hit him then, sharp as lightning, splitting the sky. His mother wasn't eating better than him. She was saving every fresh bite for him, giving herself the leftovers, the things others would throw away. She wasn't lying to protect herself. She was lying to protect him. Micah stood there, sandwich in hand, stomach twisting, not from hunger but from shame. The world outside had already decided he wasn't enough. Too poor, too soft, too strange. But inside this broken little home, his mother fought that lie with every crumb she packed into his lunchbox. Every stacked sandwich was a declaration: you are worth more than what the world sees. You are worth saving. Micah didn't finish that sandwich. He wrapped it back up and put it in the fridge, feeling something heavy and permanent settle into his chest, a promise he didn't know he was making yet. One day, somehow, he would pay her back, not just with good grades or a clean room. He would build a life that proved she hadn't loved him in vain. If you believe that no sacrifice ever truly disappears, that every act of love leaves a legacy far beyond what we can see, stay with us. HeartStories is where we honor the quiet warriors, the broken healers, and the ones who turn scraps into a future. This is just the beginning of Micah's story. Micah grew taller but stayed invisible. In a town where last names mattered more than kindness and football, stats decided your worth. He floated through the halls like a ghost. Teachers barely learned his name. Classmates passed him in corridors without a glance. Sometimes it felt like the world had left him behind, alongside the cracked sidewalks and broken promises that littered his neighborhood. But Micah carried something they couldn't see. Every night after homework was done and dishes were stacked neatly beside the sink, he pulled out scraps of printer paper and sketched tiny houses with big windows, rooms flooded with sunlight, kitchens with tables big enough for every dream a kid could carry home from school. He didn't draw mansions or penthouses like the ones in magazines. He drew places that felt safe, places someone like him, poor, queer, forgotten, might actually belong. When he ran out of printer paper, he used grocery bags. When he ran out of pens, he carved designs into the backs of his notebooks with a bent paper clip. His mother never said much when she found him asleep on the kitchen floor, cheek pressed against a drawing. She would just drape an old quilt over his thin shoulders and whisper into the dark, "Keep building, baby." And Micah did not, because he thought anyone would ever notice, but because dreaming felt better than breaking. Money grew tighter as middle school bled into high school. His mother's diner slashed hours after a new chain restaurant opened down the road. Some nights there wasn't much more than canned soup and toast on the table. Micah learned to pretend he wasn't hungry. He learned to fold his body into small spaces, to not ask for field trip money, to quietly patch his shoes with duct tape when the soles started to split. Through it all, he kept drawing. When kids jeered at him in gym class, calling him freak and fairy, he went home and designed community centers with rainbow murals and safe rooms. When he overheard teachers muttering that kids like that never go anywhere, he spent weekends in the library teaching himself how buildings stood up even when the world tried to knock them down. There was a scholarship competition posted one day on the counselor's bulletin board, full ride to a top design school for a portfolio of original architecture concepts. Micah's hands trembled as he tore down the flyer. He didn't have a fancy resume. He didn't even have proper art supplies, but he had something. None of the polished kids did. A hunger so deep it had folded itself into his bones. For weeks, he barely slept. After school, after closing shifts at the grocery store, after tutoring younger kids for spare change, he stayed up carving his dreams onto stolen poster boards. His mother watched him with tired, proud eyes. She packed his lunches a little heavier. She scrubbed his uniform by hand when the laundromat bill became too much. And when Micah's old, battered laptop finally blinked its last, she pawned the only piece of jewelry she had left, her mother's locket, to buy him a second-hand replacement. She didn't tell him. He found the pawn slip months later stuffed between unpaid electric bills. Submission day arrived with a sky so gray it felt like the world might fall in on itself. Micah packed his portfolio into a borrowed messenger bag, kissed his mother's forehead as she slept, and walked 3 miles to the post office because they didn't have gas money for the car. He mailed the package with shaking hands, heart pounding so hard he thought the clerk might hear it. Weeks passed, then months. Life didn't pause to wait for good news. Bills stacked higher. His mother's cough got worse. Winter gnawed through the cracks in their windows. But Micah kept sketching, kept believing that maybe, just maybe, a life better than survival was possible. The letter came on a Tuesday. Micah almost missed it, tucked between overdue notices and junk mail. His hands went numb as he read the words over and over, barely able to process them. Full scholarship, housing included. A new beginning. His knees gave out on the porch, gravel biting into his skin, but he didn't feel it. All he could think about was his mother's tired face lighting up when he told her that night they celebrated with a box of day-old cupcakes from the diner and a bottle of store-brand soda. They sat cross-legged on the floor, laughing until their sides hurt, the flicker of the broken kitchen light strobing above them like a cheap disco ball. Micah didn't need a cap and gown to feel like he had graduated from something much bigger than school. He had survived being invisible. He had built something real out of nothing but stubbornness and scraps of hope. Before he went to bed, Micah found a wrinkled piece of notebook paper tucked into his pillowcase. His mother's handwriting, crooked but fierce, stared back at him. "You are my best dream come true. Keep building, baby. Keep flying." Micah folded the note and tucked it into his wallet, right behind the scholarship letter. He would carry both with him, always. Not because he needed reminders of where he came from, he could never forget that, but because he needed reminders of why he had to keep going. Because somewhere out there, kids like him were still eating crusts and pretending they were full. Somewhere out there, someone else was being told they were too strange, too soft, too poor to matter. And Micah knew the truth now. Love, real love, didn't just fill your plate, it filled your future. College cracked open a new world for Micah. In a city where no one cared who his father was or where his shoes came from, he could finally stretch without fear of hitting invisible walls. For the first time, he spoke about design with professors who listened, laughed in calves without flinching, at passing stairs, walked streets lit by neon and possibility. He came out quietly, not as a rebellion, but as a truth he no longer needed to hide. Micah thrived in the quiet corners of campus building models late into the night, crafting designs meant not just to impress, but to shelter the broken, the lost, the overlooked, people like him. When the offer came to intern for a nonprofit dedicated to creating safe spaces for LGBTQ+ youth, he accepted without hesitation. It felt like building a world he wished had existed when he was younger. A world where a boy eating stale sandwiches in a leaking kitchen might have believed he belonged. The gala was supposed to be a celebration, the nonprofit's annual fundraiser held at a glittering downtown venue. Micah had spent weeks preparing the design, warm lights open spaces, art installations that whispered hope into every corner. On the night of the event, he wore the only suit he owned, pressed and slightly too big, but it didn't matter. Pride curled inside him, fragile and bright. He had earned his place here. Guests arrived in waves of perfume and polished shoes, clinking glasses and exchanging smiles. Micah floated among them, half host, half ghost, making sure the evening unfolded like the dream he had stitched together from blueprints and belief. For a moment, under the soft, golden light surrounded by laughter and music, it was easy to forget where he came from, until he didn't. A cluster of guests near the entrance pulled his attention, laughter breaking louder than the rest. Micah glanced over instinctively and felt his body lock into place. Standing near the check-in table, holding hands with a woman who looked like she stepped out of a lifestyle magazine, was his father. Age had thickened him, softened the edges of his face, but there was no mistaking the way he held himself, like the world owed him something. Beside them stood a boy, maybe 16, with the easy confidence Micah had never known at that age. The boy wore a suit that actually fit, a rainbow pin glinting proudly on his lapel and an arm slung casually around the woman's waist. It wasn't just the shock of seeing his father again that split something open inside Micah. It was the realization that his father had found a new family, and the son he had abandoned Micah for was openly, unapologetically gay. The irony was so sharp it almost made him laugh. All those years of silence, of shame, of whispered prayers, to be someone else, while somewhere out there his father was learning how to love a boy Micah could never be. Micah turned away before their eyes could meet, a rush of old bitterness rising in his throat. He busied himself rearranging centerpieces that didn't need rearranging, fixing details that didn't need fixing, anything to anchor himself against the undertow pulling at his ribs. He heard snatches of conversation drifting across the room, praise for the young boy's upcoming leadership award. Congratulations to the parents for raising such a brave, inspiring kid. Words Micah had never heard directed at himself. Words he had long stopped believing were meant for boys like him. As the night wore on, Micah kept to the edges. The gala ended with standing ovations and heartfelt speeches. Donors pledged money. Promises hung heavy in the glittering air. Micah watched from the sidelines, heart thudding dully against his ribs, wondering if anyone else could see the boy folding himself smaller and smaller inside his own skin. When the final guest slipped out into the night, Micah stayed behind to pack up stray programs and empty glasses. He didn't notice his father approach until a shadow fell across the table he was clearing. Micah didn't look up. He didn't need to. He could feel the weight of those eyes, the familiar mixture of pride and regret, shame and selfishness. A hand hovered awkwardly near the edge of the table, then retreated. No words passed between them. None were needed. In the silence, Micah found an answer he hadn't even realized he was searching for. He didn't need an apology. He didn't need explanations or tears or excuses. His life wasn't missing anything that man could offer. Micah finished stacking the chairs and walked away without speaking. His father remained standing there, hands still awkwardly hovering, as if reaching for a past he had long ago thrown away. Outside, the city buzzed with life. Micah stepped into the night head high, the cool air peeling away the last brittle layers of the boy who once believed a full sandwich meant a full family. He wasn't the abandoned son anymore. He was the architect of his own life, built not from what was given to him, but from everything he had once been denied. He didn't look back. There was nothing left there worth seeing. Life after the gala unfolded in the quiet ways Micah had learned to trust. His internship became a job offer. His designs, once tucked into the margins of forgotten notebooks, now rose into real walls and welcoming spaces. Every blueprint he signed, every foundation he helped pour, stitched something back together inside him. Not all wounds left scars, you could see. Some simply made you quieter, steadier, less willing to waste time on things that didn't feed your soul. Micah's world grew, but he never built walls too high to see over. He stayed connected to the people who needed it most. Teenagers who had been thrown out of their homes for loving the wrong way. Mothers who worked 3 jobs to keep the lights on. Boys who ate the crusts and called it a feast. His work wasn't glamorous, it wasn't viral, but it was real brick by brick. He was rebuilding the pieces of a world that had once tried to erase him. Late one evening, while closing up the community center, he helped design. Micah noticed a figure waiting by the entrance. At first, he thought it was a lost parent or a straggler looking for shelter. It wasn't until the figure shifted under the dim security light that Micah recognized him. His father looked smaller somehow. The broad shoulders, Micah remembered, seemed weighed down, the sharpness dulled. His jacket hung off him, more empty cloth than structure. In his hands, he clutched a battered envelope, crumpled like he had folded and unfolded it 100 times. Micah didn't move, neither did his father. The air between them felt brittle, stretched thin by things that could never be unsaid. Micah could have turned around, could have locked the doors and walked away. No one would have blamed him. Maybe even the world would have called it justice. But Micah stayed. Not because forgiveness came easy, it didn't. Not because he needed closure. He had already closed that chapter long ago. No, he stayed because somewhere in the hollowed-out man standing before him, Micah saw a reflection of the boy he once was. Abandoned, afraid, starving for something he didn't know how to ask for. His father's voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. Stripped of pride, stripped of excuses, he spoke of mistakes he couldn't undo, of debts he couldn't pay, of a life that had crumbled after too many wrong turns. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for a second chance. He asked for help finding work. Anything that might help him rebuild something, no matter how small, from the ruins of what he had destroyed. Micah listened, really listened. Not to the words, but to the empty spaces between them, to the way his father's hands trembled, the way his shoulders sagged, as if bracing for rejection that felt inevitable. There was a time when Micah would have given anything to hear an apology, to see a moment of regret. But standing there in the cold glow of a flickering light, he realized something deeper. He didn't need the past to change to move forward. He didn't need his father to be better. To be whole, Micah thought of the houses he built, the kids who walked through doors he had designed and felt for the first time like they belonged somewhere. He thought of his mother stacking stale bread with a smile, choosing love over bitterness every single day without asking for anything in return. Micah didn't promise miracles. He didn't offer absolution, but he handed his father a brochure for the center's rebuild program, a place where struggling men could earn work dignity and slowly stitch a future out of broken parts. A place Micah had fought to create, because he knew not everyone got it right the first time. He told him quietly, steadily, that there would be no shortcuts, no special favors. If he wanted a second act, he would have to build it with his own hands. Micah wouldn't carry him, but he wouldn't kick him down either. His father took the brochure with shaking fingers. Their eyes met. Not as father and son, not as betrayer and abandoned, but simply as two men standing at the crossroads of what had been and what could still be. Micah watched him leave. Envelope clutched to his chest, steps uneven but determined. A part of him ached, not out of grief for what had been lost. That grief had burned itself out long ago, but for what could never fully be repaired. Some fractures never fully set straight, no matter how much mortar you packed into the cracks. Still, Micah believed in building. Even broken things deserved a foundation to stand on. Maybe that was what forgiveness really was. Not forgetting, not excusing, but offering the tools and letting someone decide if they were willing to rebuild themselves. Micah locked the center, pocketed the keys, and stepped into the night. The city buzzed around him, tireless and indifferent. Above it all, the stars blinked in the dark like stubborn beacons. He tightened his coat against the wind and walked toward home, each step steady, each breath a quiet vow. He had survived, he had built, and he would keep building, long after the wreckage of the past faded behind him. Years later, when Micah stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony of the new community center, the moment didn't feel like a victory parade. It felt like a quiet sunrise after a long, bruised night. The building was modest compared to the glossy towers downtown, but every brick whispered stories of survival. It wasn't just a shelter, it was a promise, walls wide enough for dreams, windows tall enough for hope to climb through. a kitchen always stocked, a library with chairs big enough to curl up and disappear into a better world. And above the door, carved into a simple wooden sign, was a name that made Micah's chest tighten every time he looked at it. The Maria Heart Center. His mother's name, her legacy. Micah had funded it himself through years of quiet work and small victories. He turned down investors who wanted to plaster logos over the walls. He refused charity galas that would have made the center about them instead of the people it was meant to serve. This wasn't about spotlight. It was about filling the spaces where people had once been forgotten, including a boy who had once sat at a chipped table believing a sandwich could cover the ache of a missing father. On the opening day, children darted through the halls, their laughter echoing against the fresh paint. Mothers wiped tears with rough hands as they signed lease papers for apartments they could finally afford. Teenagers in rainbow pins and threadbare backpacks clutched acceptance letters and scholarships stepping through doors Micah had once only dared to dream of. His mother was there too, standing just behind the crowd, her hands twisting nervously. Her hair was grayer now, her frame thinner, but when Micah caught her eye, she smiled, the same crooked, fierce smile that had carried them through so many hollow nights. He walked toward her, his hands trembling slightly, and pressed the center's first golden key into her palm. "This is yours," he said quietly, the words catching in his throat. "It always was." She didn't say anything at first, just traced the grooves of the key with her thumb, like a prayer. Then she pulled him into a hug so tight he could feel all the years collapse between them, and no apologies, no regrets, just gratitude, breathing between them as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Micah stood beside his mother and watched the center come alive. Somewhere deep inside, the boy who once folded himself small at lunch tables and library corners stood a little taller. He knew the world would never be perfect. It would still have broken fathers and empty plates and nights when hope felt like a fool's errand. But there would also be places like this, places stitched together by stubborn hands and endless love, places where the forgotten learned they were never truly invisible. Micah didn't build a monument to his pain. He built a lighthouse for those still finding their way home. And sometimes that was enough. What's one act of quiet sacrifice someone made for you? One you didn't recognize until much later? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear it. If you believe in honoring those quiet heroes, if you believe that love leaves the strongest foundations, make sure to subscribe to Heart Stories and stay with us for more true stories that remind us why we keep building.